It's Tom Dupree, the former Deputy Assistant Attorney General. Always enjoy and learn a lot having Tom on. These last flutter of cases, Tom, with maybe the exception of the Remain in Mexico one, were clear conservative rulings and defeats for the Biden administration. For the EPA, you could say tangentially, the decision on Roe v. Wade. But this was the only one I would think that this White House would celebrate. The others, not so much. What do you make of it?
I think that's right, Neil. I think the White House is celebrating this immigration ruling. As we heard, the justices are allowing President Biden to repeal Trump's Remain in Mexico policy. The environmental case is very different. And there, what we saw the Supreme Court do this morning is very similar to what it did when it struck down OSHA's test or vaccinate mandate. The Supreme Court basically said the agency just doesn't have the authority to regulate in such a sweeping fashion as it's trying to do.
So what are we looking at here? And now with, Judge Jackson coming in for the new term in the fall, I'm just wondering what you expect. I mean, it's I don't want to trivialize it. You're swapping out a liberal for a liberal. So it's still a 6-3 court, conservatives versus more liberally minded justices. What do you expect from this court now?
I expect a continuation of where they're going. They're going to be controlled by a conservative majority. To your point, there's not going to be a great ideological shift when you're replacing one liberal vote with another liberal vote. But at the same time, justices over history will tell you that any time you have a single member added to the court, given that it's a 9-person body, it's a new court. The interpersonal dynamics are different. The negotiations behind the scenes are different. And you can never quite anticipate how that might ultimately play out. But at least for the foreseeable future, Neil, I think we're going to continue to see the conservative majority controlling the outcomes in most of the big ticket cases.
You know, Tom, you follow the Supreme Court very closely. I'm just wondering, do they weigh things like that as to how it looks if they're all one way, all the decisions in this case go against the administration in power? Do they sort of stack them up and say, guys, every one of these goes against this administration's grain? Or are they, I assume above that, but they have to be cognizant of that, don't they?
I think they're aware of that, Neil, but I don't think it really affects their decisions too much one way or the other. I think at the end of the day, they're just looking at what the law says, they're looking at what the Constitution says, and they're just doing their God-given best to reach the correct outcome. And in a particular administration, one administration might rack up a lot of wins before the Supreme Court, another administration might face a lot of losses. But at the end of the day, I don't think the Supreme Court is keeping track. I think it's doing its best just to reach the right outcome in all of these cases.
I assume that's the case. Just leave it to me to be cynical and petty. I would be curious, though, what you make of how the president himself has responded, particularly to the Roe v. Wade decision. It's one thing to be against what the justices did, but he took it one step further just today, being against what this court is all about. This is from President Biden.
With this decision, the conservative majority of the Supreme Court shows how extreme it is, how far removed they are from the majority of this country. They've made the United States an outlier among developed nations in the world. It's a realization of an extreme ideology and a tragic error by the Supreme Court, in my view.
All right, I apologize. That was not at all I thought we were going to show. The president just besmirching the Supreme Court itself, and they're not up to the job. This is horrendous, blah, blah, blah. That is not a surprise at his point of view, but the fact that he keeps pounding it, they take great exception to President Trump questioning the validity, the propriety of the last presidential election, yet here they are questioning a major institution that go beyond just opposing a decision to maybe making a mockery of the court itself. What do you make of that?
And that's the dividing line, Neil. It's all well and good to criticize particular decisions of the Supreme Court where you disagree. I mean, Lord knows I do that all the time. People do that all the time. But I think it's another thing entirely if you're calling into question the very legitimacy of the Supreme Court and somehow suggesting that it's illegitimate or that the justices aren't acting in good faith or are acting to implement an extreme conservative agenda, that sort of thing. I think that's wrong. And I think ultimately it's harmful and destructive to our country because people have to have faith that the Supreme Court and these justices are doing their absolute best to interpret the Constitution fairly and impartially.
Now, one thing that the president did indicate today in Madrid is that, wrapping up this NATO meeting, is that he supports an exception to the filibuster to essentially codify Roe v. Wade into law. What did you make of that and that approach to this?
Well, I'm not quite sure that that works. I guess one problem I have is that any time they start creating exceptions to this or that, exceptions to the filibuster, they did that with judges, they did that with justices. It's kind of like at some point you're almost abolishing the filibuster because you're creating so many exceptions. I'm not sure that they have the votes in Congress to do that. Frankly, I think the administration is in a tough spot. They're doing their best right now to deal with that new Dobbs decision overturning Roe versus Wade. But I think at this point, their options are fairly limited in what the administration can do.
So finally, just I did want to just remind you what the president said. You know this better than I, to sort of crystallize, you know, how big a deal this was for the leader of one branch of government to say this about another. America is better positioned to lead the world than we ever have been. He goes on to say, with a very big but there, that right now the message of this court is just the opposite. I just want to make sure I have the full quote here. He was saying that this decision is destabilizing, and this outrageous behavior of the Supreme Court of the United States in overruling not only Roe v. Wade, but essentially challenging the right to privacy is something that he could understand why the American people are frustrated because of what this court did. That's a little over the top, don't you think?
I agree, Neil. And look, it's all fine if the president wants to criticize a particular decision, but when he starts launching these attacks at the integrity of the court, I think that has very harmful long-term ramifications. I don't think it's good for the nation, and you would hope in the future he'll confine his criticism to particular decisions rather than going after the legitimacy of the Supreme Court itself.
All right. Thank you, my friend, very, very much. I just want to remind people what he said there, because it's very unusual for one branch to rip the other and even question its effectiveness. Again, if the shoe were on the other foot, of course, not too long ago it was, with many people targeting President Trump at the time for how he repudiated the last election, that was an insult to our system of government. And here they take a move when it comes to questioning even the validity of the Supreme Court itself here. So what's good for the goose isn't always good for the gander. An expression I never understood, but it is what it is.